Good morning, good afternoon, and good evening to attendees worldwide, and a very special thank you for joining this Daring Cities session. My name is Anina Hatong, and I am an officer in the Resilient Development Team at the ICLEI World Secretariat. And I do have the most immense pleasure of facilitating today's session, which is titled Resilient Cities, Safer Communities, Confronting the Climate-Linked Insecurity. And so, over the last couple of months, there has been a notable theme across the Daring Cities virtual forum, where we have already heard from cities showcasing exceptional leadership, a commitment to bold climate action, and of course, a determination to raise resilience efforts in the face of climate challenges. However, we have also observed a need for deeper engagement with the complex and often overlooked security dimensions of climate change. And as we already know, cities are acting as key actors in the national climate strategies because of their proximity to communities, which can enable scalable, targeted, and ambitious goals hand in hand with context-dependent solutions. At the same time, however, while cities are growing at a fast pace, they're also not sufficiently funded to provide adequate public services to meet this rising demand. So, coupled with other social issues such as wealth inequality, land pressure, natural disasters, food, water scarcity, this ultimately does threaten the system, with organized crime as one of the consequences and resilience as a whole undermined. So we have a bit of a challenging question ahead of us today. How can cities confront the overlapping challenges of this safety crisis while at the same time building resilience? And today, to help answer that question, we're very, very honored to be joined by an excellent lineup of speakers, experts who will be bringing deep insights from policy, practice, and research. And they'll be guiding us through the intersections of climate resilience and urban safety and help us explore what meaningful, actionable solutions can look like. So as we go through today, this session, we do ask our audience to write down any of their questions in the Q&A box below. And if time permits, we'll be addressing some of them during the discussion segment towards the end. But before we do hear from our speakers, we would like to take this opportunity first to hear from you using a Mentimeter poll that our events team will share. And we'll just be asking three very short questions to kind of gauge the understanding from our audience today on the topic. So as you can see there, the first question that we are asking simply is, where are you joining us from today? Understanding maybe the time zone differences might be different for some of us. Would be great to see where we're all coming from. And I see that we already have some answers popping up there. Cologne, Germany, which is actually not too far away from us in Bonn. I'm seeing Philippines. I see Greece, United Kingdom, Argentina. Great. Australia, great, very far away. Milan, fantastic. Wow. And I see also some people are putting their answers in the chat box below as well. So welcome to everyone. Great. Um, Wonderful. I think we can then move on to the next question, which is we would like to hear from you. What kind of word comes to mind when you hear climate change and urban security? What is something that you kind of think of? Um, Instability. Okay. Right off the bat. Water. Very interesting. Relying on community. Urgency. That's another word that's popping up. Finance. Okay. Interesting. Vulnerability. I see someone in the chat has said drought. Okay. Resilience hub. Adaptation. Violence. Okay. Interesting. Yeah. All very good key terms. I would agree with all of those ones that have been mentioned. And okay, I think we can now move on to the third question. Thanks so much, everyone, for your previous responses. Um, The previous two questions were more cloud-based questions, but now we want to ask on a poll, a spectrum between 1 to 5, the question of how prepared do you think your city is to handle climate-related security risks? And some of us are already putting their answer in. Right now, it looks like minimally prepared is the top answer. Okay, got it. Yeah, still minimally prepared. A couple of us, yeah, some say are moderately prepared. One says well prepared. That's great. And a few have also said not at all prepared. All right. Well, that kind of gives us a little bit of insights into where you are currently situated. And I think, yeah, there's a lot more that we could unpack with those answers. But I think that puts us in a nice place then to jump back into the session. And so now, just to kick things off, I'd like to introduce a speaker who unfortunately was not able to make it today, but will help us in setting the scene for the rest of the discussion via a video recording. So Peter Schwarzstein is an environmental journalist, researcher, speaker, and advisor. He's worked on water, food security, and particularly the conflict climate nexus for more than a decade across 30 countries, most of which have been in the Middle East and Africa. And much of his writing has been for National Geographic, but he's also published regular long-form articles for the New York Times, BBC, Foreign Affairs, among others. And he's also a non-resident fellow at the Center for Climate and Security, a TED Fellow, and was a global fellow for the Wilson Center's Environmental Change and Security Program. His independent consultancy clients have also included UNEP, UNDP, UNICEF, HRW, and IWMI. His book, The Heat and the Fury on the Front Lines of Climate Violence, is the first from-the-ground exploration of climate's contribution to global violence, which was published last year in 2024. And unfortunately, while he is not able to join us for this session, in his absence, he has very kindly sent us a video recording. We first really should acknowledge that we gave him quite a impossible task of summarizing from his point of view the local impacts of climate security in just 5 minutes. And unfortunately, this is something that you could spend hours upon. So it has been condensed a bit, and so we're presenting that version of his response. But if you would like to see the full version with many more interesting points that he covers, we're also going to be dropping the link of that in the chat box below for your reference. And we do highly recommend that you watch that later. So yeah, with that information, I think we can go ahead and play that video.
Hello, I'm extremely sorry not to be joining you live for today's discussion, but I hope these few extremely brief remarks will help to set the scene for a discussion of what I deem to be one of the single most important parts of the kind of urban and climate security discussion, and yet one of the simultaneously most drastically under-discussed. As most, if not all of you tuning in are acutely aware, there's an awful lot of discussion of the ways in which climate change is contributing to conflict and violence at a macro level, at an interstate level. And yet, despite the fact that violence is often significantly likelier at a kind of more localized level, the focus is often exceptionally limited. First, I'm going to very briefly discuss perhaps some of the reasons why localized climate-related violence is that bit more likely. First of all, there can be a good deal more incentive to violence at a local level on issues related to climate and violence than there is at a macro level, at an interstate level. And that's partly because villages, communities of another sort, tribes, can in many instances actually hope to pilfer more resources, more water, more arable land, more minerals from their neighbors in ways that nation states seldom can actually do. So first of all, just the incentive structure is that bit different. Secondly, a lot of the time, this kind of localized climate and environment related violence is actually a direct consequence of states, nation states, transferring to a lower level violence that they themselves have successfully avoided. So I'll provide an example to that effect. I've done quite a lot of work in the Senegal River Valley in West Africa, where the riparian states, Senegal, Mali, Mauritania, Guinea, have enjoyed a high degree of success in working together to develop the river valley, and as a consequence reduced some of these potential sources of interstate tension. As a consequence, however, they have contributed to some of the forms of herder-farmer violence in the area by basically blocking off and denying access to herders land that was previously some of their kind of go-to dry season pasture. So really, there's a complicated interplay between climate and environment related violence at a lower level and at a kind of more macro level. And then finally, there can just be many fewer restraining influences at a local level. And to give you another real world example here, speaking to a Bangladeshi water negotiator a few years ago, the way he put it to me was that when we, Bangladesh, engage in water talks with upstream India and upstream China, we put our best people on the task. We ensure that we have political and technical expertise at the requisite level. However, when you have sort of water problems between municipalities, water problems between villages in, for example, the Meghna Delta, you don't have the same kinds of resources. You don't have kind of officials or personnel of the same kind of talents or the same skills. And as a consequence, there can just be fewer obstacles to disputes swelling into challenges of a significantly more violent nature. A few real-world examples. So a lot of the time when a lot of the most localized violence is playing out in villages, in rural communities where sort of agriculture is the bread and butter of the local economy, but where agriculture is kind of collapsing at a kind of unprecedented speed due to an array of climate stresses and a number of other essentially related problems. And in so many of these contexts, the people who are most likely to migrate first and migrate in greatest numbers at a time of kind of climate-related economic collapse are a community's best and brightest, the individuals who are most intimately connected with and most intimately involved with the local conflict resolution bodies. And as these local conflict resolution bodies, these local councils, kind of struggle in the absence of those leading lights, in the absence of those leading citizens, a lot of the kind of village disputes, which were previously prevented from morphing into significantly more destructive disagreements, can just sort of metastasize at a commensurate speed. And so conducting a lot of work in sort of rural, arid parts of southern Jordan, I found an extremely close relationship between the sort of out-migration of that kind of village creme de la creme and dramatic increases in housebreaking, dramatic increases in substance abuse, dramatic increases in fights both within the community and with adjacent communities. Secondly, you can get a lot of localized violence within a lot of the urban neighborhoods that a lot of these rural migrants are migrating to. So, for example, in Baghdad, in some of the kind of outer districts where I've been working pretty extensively since about 2014, you have two particular sorts of sort of violence that are intimately connected to the large numbers of people arriving in the city from the countryside. The first one of which is pretty prolific fights and in some instances severe violence on construction sites. Because what happens is that a lot of these sort of ex-farmers essentially arrive in the city without many of the skills that are kind of best suited to an urban workplace. And as a consequence, one of the few forms of work that is sort of relatively easily open to them is day labor activity. But in engaging in that kind of work, they are kind of essentially inadvertently undermining the existing cohort of day laborers, many of whom, unsurprisingly and understandably, do not welcome the competition and certainly do not welcome the depression in wages that can result from surplus labor. And then secondly, you can also get a revival of some of the kind of sectarian tensions that previously existed in some of these neighborhoods, but had sort of lost some of their potencies over time, but that are now kind of getting reinvigorated by the kind of forcing together of peoples who weren't previously kind of perhaps used to engaging with members of another community, members of another religious sect. And so you can end up basically having a reinvigoration of long-standing sectarian tensions that have nevertheless sort of run their course, so to speak, in an urban setting, but that can kind of gain a new energy from the arrival of folks who just haven't necessarily engaged with quote-unquote the other for some time previously.
I thought that was a brilliant message that he shared with us. And yeah, once again, we would like to extend our heartfelt gratitude to Peter for this video. Really appreciate him taking the time to record it so that we could all benefit and learn from his valuable insights. And I also think it's a great way of kicking off today's session. So, with that, I would like to now introduce our very first speaker, Daniela Chacon. She is the co-founder and executive director of Tandem, which is an Ecuadorian nonprofit that builds bridges of dialogue and collective action among citizens, civil society, the private sector, and local governments to create more responsive and inclusive cities. And under her leadership, Tandem has grown into a nationally recognized organization that has implemented over a dozen civic innovation programs across the country. A lawyer and an urban policy expert, Daniela has served as vice mayor and city councilor of Quito from 2014 to 2019, where she championed initiatives to promote walking and cycling, recover public spaces, and advance gender equity in public transportation. She designed and launched Quito's first system for reporting sexual harassment in public transit and co-founded the Women in Motion Initiative, a Latin American network promoting women's leadership and sustainable mobility. She's also a member of the Global Placemaking Leadership Council. And she also holds a law degree from the Universidad of San Francisco de Quito and a Master of Public Administration from George Washington University, where she studied as a Fulbright Scholar. So with that, Daniela, thank you so much for joining us today. We have a lot of questions that we'd love to ask you about how your work connects with today's discussion. But the one that we would like to is surrounding actually your experience as a city mayor in Quito and the leadership and firsthand exposure to the challenges that city faced. How have you seen climate-related pressures interact with issues of urban security, including the presence of organized crime or informal power structures? And maybe if you could share also some specific examples of how your work has addressed these challenges, along with maybe some lessons learned that other cities could draw from Quito's approach to building resilience in the face of these overlapping risks. So the floor is yours.
Thank you, Anina. Thank you for the invitation. I'm really excited to be here. And good morning and good afternoon to everybody who join us. So I think one of the first things, and maybe or maybe not you're aware of this, but Ecuador, just in the past 3 years, just became a really violent place. You know, we were in between Colombia and Peru, and we always praise ourselves for being, you know, an island of peace. We didn't have the violence problems that these other countries had faced for a long time. Nonetheless, of course, due to many causes that I'm not going to be able to talk about right now, Ecuador became one of the strong players within the organized crime networks in Latin America. And from the past few years, we've seen an increased violence, especially in the coast of the country, of course, in the ports. But one of the things that have happened is that a lot of people from these cities are starting to migrate to cities in the Andes, and especially to Quito, because Quito is the capital, and Quito also maybe has more opportunities for jobs and employment. And one of the things that has been that the data has been showing us in the past few years is that most of the people that are migrating to neighborhoods that were already facing a lot of challenges, including violence that was not related to organized crime, but that is starting to be related to organized crime. So the pattern that we're seeing, and of course, we still need more data to really understand how this is working, but we've seen this in other cities in the region, is that precisely in those neighborhoods where there's a lack of presence from the state, both the local and the national state, in many of the issues, become the places where people, of course, migrate, but also the places that have much more vulnerability to the presence of organized crime. And to give you a specific example, in Quito, one of the main neighborhoods, one of the biggest neighborhoods actually in the city, is called Calderon, which is in the northern part, in the outskirts of the city, that has a very low public transport network. So a lot of informal transportation, a network that has been functioning from the past 20, 25 years, to be honest, but that now is being permeated by organized crime. The other thing that we're seeing in Calderon, for example, is the neighborhood that has the highest informal settlements in the city and has the longest process to formalize those settlements. We're also seeing that it's one of the places in the city that has the lowest amount of green and parks for the people, and a little bit of water scarcity. We're not facing that as much in Quito, but this is one of the driest areas of the city. And we've seen how violence has steeply increased in Calderon. And it's violence that is both related to organized crime, but it's also violence between the community. And so what we've been doing is that understanding better this data and understanding how the violence patterns are working, both affecting men, but also affecting women, because the other thing that we're seeing is that there is not only an increase, for example, in the homicide rates, robberies and others, but also in sexual violence, especially in public spaces. And so we're seeing that these patterns are having a differentiated effect between men and women. And one of the things that we created when I was at the municipality of Quito is that Quito has always had a very strong citizen participation environment. I don't know how to say this in English, but we created a ordinance, a legal framework that was really trying to give more power to the people, so that people can really be able to bring solutions that they need, that are created by their own, and that need to be integrated with the policies, with the services that the municipality and the national government have to provide in the cities, but really focusing on giving the people the most tools so that they can start trying to solve the issues that they can solve within the power that they have and the tools that they have, but that the legal framework can actually help, bring about the change. And we've been working, so through this ordinance, we created several committees, citizen participation committees, and one of the committees is focused on security issues. And what we're seeing is that the safe and security committees in Quito are really working to help communities to better integrate and to better understand the challenges that they're facing, and to better organize so that they can not only face the challenges, but also demand for the changes the communities need. And so what is interesting about the safe and security committees is that they're not only focused on safety issues, of course, public spaces, but also road safety, but also climate related risks. And so the committee starts developing all of the capacities that they're needed so that they have their own experts, the expert on safety, the expert on road safety, the expert on climate change. And they, through participatory processes, they're able to determine what are the highest risks in their communities, but also what are the things that they can actually bring about some change. And then the other things that, of course, are not able to be solved through community uh, solutions, they are better organized to demand to the government. So what we've been seeing in the past few years is that this type of organization that has a long standing in Quito. Um, I would say that Quito, out of many other cities in Ecuador, is the one that has the stronger participation. But throughout the years and the lack of trust in politics in general, many citizens have decided not to participate, and we're seeing a reduced percentage of participation. But even with that reduced percentage of participation, Quito is still one of the cities that has the most participation. And one of the most important things has been precisely to create a legal framework and a policy framework that will trust the citizens to bring their solutions. I think sometimes we think that from local government or from different institutions we have the answers, and of course there's a need from a top to bottom approach, but then there's also the need from the bottom to top approach, so that we can integrate both solutions together and we can understand and give the power to the citizens and these committees that are willing to participate and that they're risking their lives. Because one of the things that we've also seen, and this is what is worrying us the most, and that we need to focus on, is that these citizen community organizations can create resilience. They are very resilient because they live there and they need to make it work. But if we, as local governments, are not ready to give the protections, to give the security to those people that are facing a lot of risks, because in some occasions they're going to be trying to step into organized crime networks, and trying to prevent those organizations to continue to gain terrain in these vulnerable places. It is not the police. It is not, those type of interventions, but it is those type of interventions together with the strong communities that we are seeing that are trying to protect their spaces from the permeation of organized crime. And when the community is able to protect their space from that, then it is easier for the institutions, both at the local and at the national level, to act. Because we have a strong community. And I'm finishing because I see that my time is up. The most important thing also is that within these organizations, we are seeing a lot of women presence. So women are usually the leaders of these community organizations. Women usually care for their own, but then they start caring for their community and they are stepping into these roles, and that's why they need much more protection because of the vulnerability of being women. I do think that citizen participation is the key to resilience, to urban resilience, and to respond to this type of to this type of challenges. We've seen some examples in Quito, but it's still, very early in our process because of the dynamics in Ecuador, but very promising if other cities have included this approach so that we can strengthen the resiliency needed for all of the challenges we're going to continue to be facing. Thank you.
And thank you. I found that presentation to be very, very inspiring. A lot of things to take note of. But first and foremost, thanks so much for educating, myself and the audience a little bit more about the landscape of Quito. And it sounds very interesting, this ordinance that you brought up, and the emphasis that is really being put on participatory processes, especially on the need for listening to women as a part of ensuring that resilience is equitably made. So yeah, thank you so much for your presentation once again, Daniela. Really, really appreciate it. So moving on to our next speaker, it's my pleasure to introduce Antonio Sampaio. Antonio is an independent researcher focused on urban safety, violence prevention, and organized crime. He has served as the thematic lead for cities and illicit economies at the Global Initiative Against Transnational Organized Crime, where he led research on violence prevention in contexts affected by criminal groups. Prior to that, he worked for a decade at the International Institute for Strategic Studies, where he created a research program focusing on urban security and the impact of war on cities. Antonio has also published in peer-reviewed journals such as the International Review of the Red Cross and Third World Thematics, and in popular news outlets such as Foreign Policy, The Washington Post, City Lab, and The War on the Rocks. He has also advised NATO on the development of a capstone doctrine on urban warfare and its civilian impact, and also worked as a journalist at Global News Channel in Brazil. He's currently pursuing a PhD at the School of Security Studies at King's College London. So, Antonio, thanks so much for joining us today. You have a very rich CV on this topic as well. So, the question that we would like to ask you today is actually around the fact that we hear a lot about the security impact of climate change, or climate security as it is often said in exaggerated terms. But in other words, broad regional or global predictions of increased tensions, potential sources of conflict, and political instability. But we also know that it's really the cities and their governments who are at the forefront and facing the brunt of climate disruptions. So, from your point of view, how do you think that we can better understand the security impact of climate change in cities? And then also, I have a follow-up question for you. Your work has in research also been on organized crime. I think you've also recently written a research report on the implications of climate change for urban crime. So maybe you can also kind of touch upon that in your intervention.
Thanks a lot, Anina. It's a pleasure to be here, and I'm really impressed by the quality of my colleagues' input, but also by the amazing diversity of the participants from Myanmar to Guatemala. It's really great to have such a global discussion. And the security sort of implications and the field of sort of climate security, it's I've been, as you said, looking into the various issues around security in cities, safety, violence prevention for close to 15 years now. And only recently I started to look more deeply into the climate aspect. And I was a sort of a newcomer to this field of climate security, as some call it. And I was really struck by how little there is on especially in terms of peer review, sort of public evidence, systematic studies on the implications of climate change for security in cities and the sort of safety, implications, the potential impacts on various things like political violence, organized crime, and especially organized crime, which was my main area of focus. So this is where this research that I've done recently and I want to continue to do sort of emerged. And one thing that emerged out of it very clearly is that a lot of the impacts, both security and non-security impacts of climate change, tend to do with the movement of people. There will be a lot of movement of people, both from rural areas due to disruptions in rural and agricultural lifestyles to cities. And I think the audience and you guys at Eclade, we all sort of are familiar with the fact that a lot of migration and displacement in the world tend to go towards cities because that's where employment is, that's where many people have families and they find livelihood opportunities, especially when the rural areas face the sort of climatic disruptions that tend to be stronger in agricultural sort of economies. So just to give a few examples, C40, the group of cities, has forecast that just 10 large global cities are expected to receive 8 million climate migrants by 2050. And the World Bank, in a very comprehensive study, forecasts 143 million people could be forced to move within their own countries just in Sub-Saharan Africa, South Asia, and Latin America by 2050. And a lot of them, if not the overwhelming majority, tend to go to cities due to those socioeconomic factors. And despite this, and these dynamics, they influence security due to some of the reasons that Daniela delve into in the case of Quito, which is the need and the vulnerability of urban governance systems and the state provision of essential services, including law enforcement, safety, prevention measures, and the broader sort of socioeconomic fabric of the cities that tends to be overwhelmed by this and the growth of informal settlements where illegal economies tend to not just informal economies with positive benefits, but also illicit economies that tend to be captured by predatory criminal actors. And that's an area that's a challenge. And you've mentioned at the start, oh, solutions, and let's look for solutions and programmatic and practical sort of propositions. And one very immediate challenge for cities that Peter also mentioned quickly is that a lot of the security institutions are national in their authority, in their line of reporting, who controls those institutions, the police, the armed forces, the intelligence services, and mayors and local governments, they tend to be sitting outside of these discussions. It varies sometimes from country to country. For instance, in Colombia, every large city has a security secretariat. In Brazil, it's the state, the regional government that has that, and the city is less involved. But it is at the level of cities that some of the impact, as we all know, tends to happen. Sea level rises, heat islands, pressure on water supplies. And especially in the case of crime, it tends to be in cities that these impacts are felt. So there are various ways that security impacts or is insecurity is exacerbated by climate change. We've already discussed some of those, such as inter-community tensions and competition over resources. And one area that, as you said, I want to focus more is on organized crime. And that's another area that has faced a severe lack of systematic or public evidence-based sort of research. There's a lot of media narratives and reporting on that, but it tends to be very sporadic, very ad hoc, and there are some cases that we understand very well. For instance, Bangladesh, because of the significant rural to urban migration due to storms and other climatic impacts in rural areas, has been very well researched in terms of how that migration impacts security, especially in Dhaka and a city that also has a lot of criminal groups, gangs. So there needs to be a greater attention and a more broad sort of research that systematically tracks the evidence on this phenomenon. But basically, a lot of the disruptions and risks related to organized crime and other security issues due to climate change are related to um, the fact that there are a lot of people moving to cities and there are severe gaps in service provision and sometimes on resources that tend to become even more scarce as time goes by. And criminal actors in cities tend to profit precisely from unmet demand for basic needs. And that's not just restricted to climate change or to natural resources such as water. It's overall, even in before we even started discussing climate change, gangs they profit from the demand, for instance, for drugs, illicit drugs that they fill the gap in this demand and they provide those services. And as resources become scarce and the state is or formal legal providers are unable or unwilling to provide these services, especially in the case of water, but also in the case of land and land tenure and land registration and governance systems, organized crime comes in and has the competitive advantage of having the not the monopoly, but an expertise in violence and a capacity for violence to forcefully take those sectors and or take the areas where the services are provided and establish their own provision of these services, often with a lot of violence involved. When we talk about the climate change impact on organized crime, we're talking about first on an increase in the opportunities available for criminals to exploit these gaps in urban service provision, which is a similar model, as I said, to various criminal operations already existing, and also to the role of urbanization, that is the urban population growth in cities, especially in a rapid, short-term or medium-term trend that we're seeing, especially in sub-Saharan Africa and South Asia at the moment. Urbanization as an additional stressor affecting global mobility patterns and providing further pressure on already overwhelmed urban systems, governance systems, service provision systems, especially in informal settlements, which also tend to be the preferred areas for criminal gangs. So I'll just finish with a very quick mention of two major areas where I see already some of the impact of climate change and some of these phenomena affecting urban security, but also areas in which I think we as a community of practice and the community of researchers need to collect more systematic data and evidence. So one is related to resource scarcity, which is not always due to scarcity, but also to incapacity of some governments, sometimes unwillingness to provide certain services. As the poll that we saw earlier in the meeting showed, there is already awareness that in the case of water, that is particularly acute. And as I said, the impact involves the vocation of organized crime to profit from these scarcities or price imbalances, either by forcefully seizing the provision of scarce resources or control over a geographic area. And we saw, for instance, already some of this impact in countries and cities that face water scarcity. For instance, in Karachi, in Pakistan, water mafias are a very well documented phenomenon, a very well documented challenge. And, in areas that are facing this type of resource scarcity, that sort of water mafias and involvement of crime in water provision can be an area of concern. I'm going to skip the issue of land for now because this is a very complex area for us to explore later, and I'm happy to answer questions. But it's also related to the way that rural to urban migration tends to increase demand for land, um, uh, increase the value of land, and lead to speculation and criminal exploitation of these land areas. But the second and final major area that I think we need to pay more attention to is, as I said, the risks related to organized crime exploiting rural to urban migration. related to organized crime, related to climate change, sorry. And this is expected to take place as rural and agricultural lifestyles are, as I said, disrupted by extreme events such as long-term droughts, repeated flooding, desertification, sea level rises. And intracity displacement is also an area of concern as people move from one area and demand for land in a certain area of the city or further away from the coast tends to increase. And particularly acute and well-registered impact of organized crime on the sort of climate-related movements is the vulnerability of these migrants and displaced population to human trafficking and situations of modern slavery as they arrive in cities. Migrants, especially low-income populations, they arrive in cities with very few social skills to take up formal jobs and other, social support networks, and they become more vulnerable to exploitation by criminal actors. So I'll end there. As you said, we can spend a long time talking about these issues, and I've become very passionate about this area because I saw that there's so much to research, and I was quite surprised actually by how little systematic evidence there is on this convergence. But I'll leave it at that for now. Thank you.
Thank you so much as well. We see that passion loud and clear from you. Yes, thank you so much for your presentation and for elaborating more about the research that you're doing, but also the data gaps that you're coming across as well. I think this is also equally important and something that Daniela had also touched upon earlier in her intervention. So thank you so much once again, Antonio. And now we will be moving on to our next speaker, last but not least, which I have very much the pleasure of introducing, which is Martin Apiolaza. And Martin is a specialist in public policy, sustainability, and social development with over 20 years of experience across Latin America. He currently serves as Director of Institutional Relations for the municipality of Godoy Cruz in Mendoza, Argentina. And throughout his career, he has served as project coordinator for the United Nations on citizen security issues across Latin America and the Caribbean. He's also been a researcher and advisor on citizen security for multiple international and national organizations, including UNICEF, UNDP, and IDP and Save the Children in 10 countries of the region, as well as being director at the Ministry of Security of Mendoza and coordinator of the National Arms Exchange Program. He holds a master's in social policy and planning, a diploma in social management, and a diploma in social project management, along with a degree in social communication. So with that, Martin, we very, very much appreciate you taking the time to join us and share your insights on this very important topic, which you do have quite a lot of experience, and we're so grateful for you to be sharing that with us today. So the question that we would like to ask you is that we've coordinated previously, and you've described that climate change is not only an environmental challenge, but is also a safety crisis in our cities. So, in your viewpoint, how can integrated planning, particularly approaches that combine climate adaptation with violence prevention through smart urban design, help cities build safer and more resilient communities?
Thank you so much, Anina. iClay team is honored to share a panel with Peter. I love his books. And Daniel, Antonio, and David. Please excuse my English. I will read some notes to try to express myself better. I would like to emphasize a third point that the climate change is not just an environmental issue. It's direct threat to safety in our cities. We can plan in isolation for climate adaptation and violence prevention. These are two sides of the same coin and need unified approach. especially at the local government level, my level of work. In my region, the Central Andes in South America is a clear example of the new reality. The climate crisis is already creating safety problems in cities from Argentina and Chile, for example. Let's look at real-life example. Water scarcity, following a prolonged drought, has led to conflict and a water crisis. In our cities, water rationing is reality and is creating social tension. The fight for water isn't just a big industrial issue. It's too a problem in our neighborhood. This situation creates opportunities for criminals to exploit people's needs, generating violence and weakening the local authority. On the other hand, wildfires have led to displacement and unsafe settlement. The fire that devastated the Valparaiso region of Chile in 2024 demonstrates how environmental disaster can become security crisis. They devastated entire neighborhoods, forcing thousands of families to flee, losing everything: their home, belonging, and social network. They often end up in vulnerable situations such as temporary shelter, where the risk of crime is much higher. In addition to this, when the rain finally came, it arrived in violent rainstorm, causing flood and landslide that destroyed critical infrastructure. We have seen neighborhoods get completely cut off from basic service. In time of chaos, criminal groups exploit the absence of the state and target vulnerable residents. Finally, the heat waves are impacting in daily life and increasing the violence. Rising temperature from urban heat island, straining power grids and leading to frequent outage. Studies show a clear link between long periods of high heat and increasing violence. Heat makes people more stressed, increase the alcohol use in public spaces, and leads to more fight and neighborhood conflict. So this example proves that climate change is also urban security crisis. So integrate planning must stop using separate budget for separate problem and start designing projects that solve multiple issues at once. Strategies such as crime prevention through environmental design can be useful. This strategy shows that the physical layout of the base can promote and prevent the crime. So, if we use this tool in planning climate adaptation projects, we get a win-win. A city that is both resilient to climate risk is also safe for the people. We can create quality public space that are cool, comfortable, and well used. Let's look at practical example of integrated approach. Imagine a part of the city with high crime rates that also floods often. In traditional planning, the local government built and concrete the channel, and the security department put more police patrol, two separate budget, two separate plan, and limited resources. With integrated planning, collaborate and unify team from urban planning department, environment, public work, and safety. The object isn't just the channel, but a resilient and safe public space. They build The park with green infrastructure for rainwater, efficient LED lighting, clear paths, and benches. This feature promotes space use and natural surveillance by now. And more importantly, this project is funded as a triple impact investment. Funding came from the climate adaptation budget, stopping flood damage, the security budget, reduce crime, and the public health budget, promoting exercise and social connection. Every dollar invested has a triple return. Look at another case. Imagine a vulnerable neighborhood that suffers from extreme heat and feel unsafe at times. The traditional planning, the environmental department start a tree planting program, and the security department install new cameras. But if we integrate climate change mitigation and adaptation planning with violence prevention, the team use heat and crime map to identify priority areas. They not only plant native tree, but also replace all the street light with solar-powered LED and install water fountain. The project gets funding from Climate Fund, tree lower temperature and energy use. The Security Fund, better lighting and more people using the space reduce crime. The cost of the tree is justified as the climate and health investment. The cost of the light is justified as a measure for energy saving and crime prevention. To truly adapt violence prevention to climate risk, we need to change the planning and budget in our cities. The goal is to invest wisely for mutual climate and security benefits, not simply to spend more. I would like to emphasize again this point. Every climate project should be seen as an opportunity to create safer city, and vice versa. Thank you.
Thank you so much for your presentation, Martin. Really super, super interesting. I appreciate the analogy of environmental challenge and safety crisis being two sides of the same coin, and that the need for climate projects at the local level should be designed systematically to solve multiple things at once and not just siloed solutions, because these environmental challenges and safety touch upon a multitude of problems at the local level. So thank you once again so much for your presentation. We have had a lot of great discussions today, and unfortunately, that doesn't mean that we have time to have a Q&A. So our sincere apologies to our audience for that. We will have time, though, to move to our closing remarks. And for this section, I would like to invite my colleague David Hakome Polit to summarize the key learnings as briefly as possible, being mindful of the time. But just kind of a brief bio about him. David was formerly the Chief Resilience Officer and Metropolitan Director of Resilience in Quito. So we have another Quito among us, Quiteño among us. And David currently now works as the head of the Resilient Development Team at the ICLEI World Secretariat at the intersection of the socioeconomic and spatial exclusion and the effects of extreme natural events, including the ones related to climate change. He aims to ensure access to essentials such as water, food, energy, transportation, and labor opportunities. And with that, I would like to invite David. The floor is yours.
Thank you very much, Anina. The first thing I would like to do is to thank the ICLEI's events team for, as always, making a great job. You, Anina, have done an amazing job moderating this panel as well. And of course, I have to thank Daniela, which I am thrilled to be with you here, Antonio, Martin, and of course, Peter, with very important messages. Um, and it's, I think the wealth and richness of everything that has been shared has been immense. Summarizing it is not an easy task, so I hope I do justice. Particularly because this is a very important conversation on migration, violence, and climate change, a very, let's say, current one. But I would like to invite us to zoom out for a moment and see the bigger picture. And the thing is that we need to connect the dots, as it has been consistently said by all the panelists. These are not isolated crises. They are deeply interconnected. When extreme weather events destroy homes and livelihoods, poverty and exclusion deepens. This in turn creates fertile ground for instability. And sometimes we've heard this firsthand for criminal organizations to recruit and thrive. These dynamics can set up reinforcing cycles where inequality and insecurity compound one another. They reinforce each other. But the same system's perspective also show us where to intervene. And we have been given hints and points on how to do this. If exclusion and poverty amplifies risk, then inclusion and poverty reduction can generate resilience. When communities are actively involved in shaping their own futures, when governance structures are aligned with democratic principles, and when decision-making is transparent and participatory, we can create positive feedback loops. And we also see these examples over and over. These loops work in the other direction. They strengthen trust, reduce vulnerability, and build shared ownership of solutions. We also see these across. In this way, climate adaptation measures social protection policies and violence prevention, plus other development objectives and efforts. They stop being separate silos and they start reinforcing each other. What's at stake is not just protecting people from the next storm or the next drought, but transforming the conditions that make people more vulnerable in the first place. That transformation happens when we treat governance, justice, and equity as central pillars of resilience, not afterthoughts, not as co-benefits. And this needs to be a consistent point also to get across through all the different networks within and outside our working places. So as we leave this session, let's carry forward the systems lens, recognizing connections, identifying leverage points, and committing to inclusive participatory approaches. That is how we can catalyze system-wide change, where climate action, social cohesion, and peace reinforce one another. Thank you.
Thank you, David. That's, I would say, a great capture that you've made of our amazing session today. I would agree very much with those keywords. I've also taken some of my own. I would say ownership, systematic solutions, not silos, participatory processes, and data were kind of the words that jumped out to me during today's discussion. So thank you once again, everyone. I do believe that means we are at the end of this session. So on behalf of ICLEI, we would very much like to thank each and every one of you for being part of this event today. I hope you agree that this has been very inspiring and insightful, and that you can take the information that you've learned and even apply it to your own work. So thank you very much to our invited speakers for being so generous with your time and sharing your insightful presentations and thoughts today. As David has already commented, a thank you to our Daring Cities events team. They're the ones that create the magic behind the scenes. And also, finally, we would like to thank you, our audience, for participating in the event, asking questions. I know we didn't get to those today, but thank you nevertheless for engaging very much with the content. As a quick little promo for the upcoming Daring Cities events that will follow, it will be also great to see you at the next one, which is titled How Can Cities Shift from Single Use to Reuse? It's taking place next week on the 27th of August, and it will introduce the upcoming City Practitioners Handbook. Very exciting. Developed by ICLE, which offers practical guidance, best solutions, best practices, and key considerations on social equity and gender in reuse systems. And you can find more information about that in the chat. So with that, once again, thank you so much on behalf of us at ICLE, and we wish you a wonderful rest of your day.